Hey guys, how are you today? So today in class we talked about the second Red Scare. And so what you have to understand is that the second Red Scare is basically when Americans are terrified that communism is spreading in the United States. And they call this the second Red Scare because clearly there was a first Red Scare. The first Red Scare happened in the 1920s. Remember that World War I came to a close, and Russia had left World War I early. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They had killed Tsar Nicholas II. There was kind of a coup d'etat where they seized power. There was a civil war, and ultimately they decided that Vladimir Lenin should become their new leader, and they wanted to become a communist country. Well, if fear took hold through the world that communism would spread, that people who were poor across the world would want to live in a society where everyone was equal. And there was some communist uprisings in countries, and the Communist Party grew in membership, but that's pretty much where it came to an end. But there was basically kind of a invasion of people's privacy during the 20s. There was, kind of the creation of the FBI, and people were afraid that there would be anarchists, people who were against all government, and communists living in the United States who would perhaps try to, you know, take over America. Communism just really went against our American ideals. And it seemed scary because most communists were atheists, so not religious people, as many Americans are religious, and Christianity seems to dominate the country, even though we have religious freedom in America. And ultimately, in a communist society, you have all this government control and oversight as they tell you what jobs to do. There's laws of personal freedom. It's supposedly about equality where no one makes more money than anyone else, but that's not entirely the case. And it really went against our ideals as Americans about working hard, trying your best, getting promoted, the American dream of having a better life. It just really didn't kind of jive with that. And rich and middle class people really didn't like the idea that their hard work would go to waste and that the money they earned would be given to, the people who were less deserving or less fortunate. It's not just about giving to charity, but it was about really taking, away what you valued most dear, and perhaps in a violent overthrow of the government. So Americans really were kind of afraid of communism in the 20s, and now we're going to be experiencing a second Red Scare in the 1950s. And you might say, how can people be just so afraid of communism? Well, people have all sorts of irrational fears. Think about what you're afraid of. Are you afraid of snakes or planes or heights or dark spaces or, small areas, death? Everyone has a fear. And at this point in time, Americans were afraid that there were communists living amongst them, and that those communist sympathizers would, kill them where they sleep, overthrow the government, let the Soviets invade the country, that the Soviets would perhaps attack them and bomb them now that the Soviet Union had their own atomic bomb. And it just seemed like the country was falling apart, and that, before you know it, the whole world was going to become communist. These were legitimate, fears that Americans were having, which is why, as I showed you in the last lecture, they were building bomb shelters, in their basements, and the government was putting out those duck and cover videos to try to convince people to, take shelter and to warn their children that although we're not officially at war with the Soviet Union, this Cold War could turn hot, and they could attack us at any time. And it still may seem, not possible in your mind, but fear is a very motivating factor. I mean, look at fear even during the pandemic. You've lived through it. You've seen that, people were terrified that somehow they would run out of food or supplies, so they ran out to get toilet paper. Fear causes you to do crazy things, and that's exactly what was going on here. People were just afraid now that the atomic bomb could destroy so much human life, in one shot. And since the Soviets now had it, that they would use it against us. Even though we have the H bomb, which is 1,000 times more powerful, they would still attack us first and kill all these Americans, and so we were very scared. And a lot of people felt like perhaps Harry Truman wasn't doing as good of a job as president as he could be. His first term in office is really FDR's fourth term, and a lot of people thought he was doing great then. He ended the World War II. Although it's a highly controversial decision today about him dropping the atomic bomb, most Americans back then were in support of it. They felt like ending the war, saving American lives, was the right choice. And, as he ran for office on his own term, really what he considered his second term, there was a lot more drama unfolding. And, he did have his critics at that point, people who wondered if he was the best person to lead the country. He believed that he could contain communism, he could stop the spread of it, and he vowed in his Truman Doctrine to do whatever it took to stop the spread. And he had some successes and failures. With the Marshall Plan, he was able to deliver food and supplies and to get those economies of Western European countries back on track, so they didn't fall to communism. He was able to avoid going to war with Russia with the Berlin airlift, right? Bringing in food and supplies and, dropping it off, from planes. But then yet again, you look at what happened with, countries around the world, and you could see that they were choosing communism willingly. And so other people say, no, you are failing at containing communism. Remember, we mentioned before domino theory. It's like when you push one domino down, they all fall down. And you see the domino theory here in action, that first Russia was communist, then they forced all those Eastern European nations, their satellite countries, to become communist. Then China chose to become communist. And we should have seen that coming, that many Americans were just kind of overwhelmed by that, action, and really just didn't know that it was going to happen, even though they should have, because many Chinese people wanted to become communist. And then North Korea became communist. And a lot of people view Truman in a negative light because, some people said, well, the Korean War was a success. We stopped the spread of communism to South Korea. Other people looked at it as a failure because, at one point we controlled all of the Korean continent, or I should say peninsula. And then, once China got involved, we lost control of North Korea. And so, they still stayed communist. So it was a failure. It kind of, I guess, depends on how you look at it. But a lot of people are very wary of what's happening, around the world, and fearful that communism will spread and that domino theory is coming true, and that Truman's not doing enough to protect Americans at home, and perhaps there are Americans living amongst us. That's what a lot of people start saying. They say, how could it be that the Americans, it took us years to make this atomic bomb. We had started working on it years before, at the beginning of the war. We were working on the atomic bomb, and we had the best scientists in the world. We had Albert Einstein's, for goodness sake, and we've got German scientists and British and Austrian, all these people who were Jews who defected and left, as refugees, and Americans, and we're able to finally create an atomic bomb, test it, and drop it in 1945 to end the war. And somehow, within a year later, the Soviets create a bomb. It made a lot of people assume that the Soviets cheated, and that the only way they were able to create a bomb was because they had stolen that information from the Americans. So we began to wonder, are there communist sympathizers living in the US? Are there spies who are willing to commit espionage and commit treason, which is the only crime listed in our US Constitution, and which the penalty for that is death? Were they working against us to give away our secrets? Was that how they were able to create a bomb and to scare us, perhaps into submission? So the US government is very worried, and perhaps panic is really starting to take over. But panic, it happens at times. I mean, look at World War II. We became so panicked that, the Japanese people living in America were perhaps spies, that we sent them off, let them lose all their property and money, and sent them for the next few years to live in a camp. So, yes, fear is very powerful, and it can be very controlling. And so at this point, we start having basically examinations of Americans. And so the FBI, which is led at this point by J. Edgar Hoover, who was actively involved actually in the 1920s in the first Red Scare, he is going to be investigating millions of government employees to see, are they communist? And when I say government employees, it's somebody who could be a mailman or a mailwoman, however they identify, but it could be, someone who, works for the court system or is a lawyer, or for example, my husband's in the military. He's also, works for the government because he works for the Army Corps of Engineers. And so it's a civilian job. That's not even part of his military life, but it's, building things, but for a government program, not like for John Deere. So they're going to investigate all these government employees. And the thing that was so wrong was that they assumed that they were guilty. And they would bring them in and they would ask them, have you ever checked out a certain book? Have you ever sat by a certain person at a bus? Name every person you've ever talked to. And most people couldn't answer these questions. They were ridiculous in nature, and they were probing. And you might say, well, don't I have any right to privacy? And the answer was no. At this point in time, you really didn't. And you still honestly don't today. You really don't have true privacy rights ever mentioned in our Constitution or Bill of Rights. It's only what the court interprets. 2,000 people end up quitting as they're subjected to these loyalty review tests. 12 people are fired because perhaps they're insubordinate. They refuse to cooperate, to answer questions. And people say, why should I have to do this? What does this have to do with my job? Isn't this discriminatory? And they were pretty much told, no, you have to do it. Otherwise, perhaps you're going to get fired or you can just quit. And the thing is, if they admit to being a communist, of course, they're going to be watched by all these different groups, including the FBI. The CIA is going to be created to deal with international issues at this point. And, they're going to be investigated and probably fired. But why? There's nothing illegal about being a communist. In this country, if you want to be a communist, if you want to be an anarchist and not support a government, if you want to be a Democrat or Republican, support the Green Party, the environment, to be a libertarian, whatever party you want, you can. That's the whole beauty of being in America, is you have those choices and freedoms, yet they're treating people as if they were communists, as if they were criminals, and as if they did something wrong, which they shouldn't have been. And as they did find a few communist supporters in the government, that only increased the fears that there were communists living amongst us. So they actually come out and they create a whole organization in Congress called HWAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And it was their job to investigate if people were loyal or not loyal to America. And they get really interested in what's happening in Hollywood, specifically because they say as television's being created, as movies are coming out, more of them, during World War II, these movies often had a propaganda-like undertone, showing how it was great to be an American hero, with John Wayne as the hero in westerns and war pictures alike. So now, what happens if someone is a movie producer and they have communist, sympathies of their own? Will they put these undertones in the movie? By watching it, could you become a communist? Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous notion. You're not just going to watch one movie and become a communist. But this was fear, really, that was taking hold of people. And so they start hauling in people to question them. Hundreds of filmmakers were accused of being a communist. And most people said, no, I'm not a communist. I don't know any communists. Leave me alone. But they kept badgering people in a ridiculous manner. 10 people in particular pleaded the fifth. So, according to your Bill of Rights, you have the right to plead the fifth, meaning you don't have to say anything because you don't want to incriminate yourself. Were these people communists? Perhaps. Or they just felt like, I'm not going to answer these questions because they're ridiculous. They go against my rights. There's nothing wrong with being a communist. And I'm not going to answer your questions because they're dumb. Most of these people, end up getting blacklisted. No one will hire them again. And if they try to, get a job in another town, or, it's pretty difficult. Some of them actually end up leaving the country. It's so bad. And you might say, well, what if you just don't show up for questions? They are giving you a subpoena. You have to show up, otherwise they can arrest you. You have to answer honestly, otherwise you're perjuring yourself on the stand, and that's a reason to get arrested. Some people start protesting what's going on at these HWAC committee meetings, and then they get arrested, despite the fact that you have the right to openly protest. And so Hollywood stops making movies that, have people question the government, and what's happening here is just really out of control.
Nowhere was the fear more damaging than in Hollywood.
We went to the movies all the time. Everybody did. And we got a lot of what we felt about our country and about right and wrong, and being a good American or being honest or courageous from the movies.
With so much publicity about America's dream factory coming under the influence of communist agents, the House Committee on Un-American Activities had a target.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I am framing my answer in the only way in which
Stand away
I have
from the
written
stand.
for Americanism for many years, and I shall
Stand
continue
away from the
to
stand.
fight for the Bill of Rights.
Hundreds of witnesses were called to testify on communist influence in Hollywood. They were asked not only to account for their own political activities, but to inform on their friends.
There will be no demonstration.
It was scary. It was very, very scary. And I was 19, and I took the fifth in front of the committee. Being an informer and placing your fellow actor, or fellow friend, fellow director in jeopardy meant that that family didn't work anymore. So that taking that step was about the worst thing that you could do to anybody.
Sorry guys, some technical difficulties there with my computer. This is ridiculous.